Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and friends and colleagues. It's my great honor to welcome you to the event, this event on justice and accountability in the context of extractive industries, with experiences shared by indigenous women's human rights defenders from Asia and Latin America, happening at the margins of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on behalf of the organizers, namely FI, Franciscans International, my own organization, whose network of Franciscans and other partners in various countries have been supporting indigenous people's struggles for many years, but also on behalf of ESCR-Net, a global network of individuals and organizations like FI, who work on social and environmental justice issues, including on the accountability of businesses and states for human rights impacts in the context of extractivism. ESCR-Net has been instrumental in facilitating the voice of social movements and indigenous communities in the discussion around, notably, a future treaty on business enterprises with respect to human rights, currently under discussion, negotiation at the United Nations. And in this context, I just want to flag one important initiative that took place, organized by ESCR-Net and IPRI early 2021. And then these were 2 learning sessions for indigenous peoples on this treaty I was mentioning. We're also extremely grateful to have many co-sponsors for this event, namely the Permanent Mission of Finland to the UN in New York, AIPP, CODECA, CIMI, King Me Papua, and the Swiss Lantern Fund. Given the very challenging timing that we have, I will try to stick to a technical moderation, but I just would like to say a couple of words on this issue now. It seems to be an always timely topic to be exposed, the topic we have today, and this is actually a sad reality. And as we saw that the forum's topic would be on justice and accountability, but with 1 year delay due to COVID, we really wanted to provide a space for indigenous women's human rights defenders who are the forefront of the resistance against the effect of extractive industries and more generally of a model relying on the unsustainable exploitation of nature and of natural resources, including through mining, logging, monocultures, and dams. And all of these have similar negative effects. That's why we put them together. And we observe the same patterns of human rights abuses and violations. The same attacks of defenders, as we will hear, and the same criminalization of legitimate protests of local communities, and first and foremost of concerned indigenous peoples. With COVID-19, that exacerbates these issues rather than brings humanity back on a more sustainable and respectful path vis-à-vis our planet. We are extremely grateful to be in a position to have 6 panelists who could not be more legitimate to share their views and thoughts on our subject today. And in the interest of time, I will obviously not present biographies of the speakers, but we will share information in the chat and as a follow-up communication later after the event. Let me simply maybe introduce them briefly before giving the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Mia Raine, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Mission of Finland to the UN in New York for her welcoming remarks. And so let me first thank very sincerely and welcome Mrs. Ilse Brands-Keris, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and Head of the UN Human Rights Office in New York. As such, Mrs. Brands-Keris, you are notably leading the efforts within the UN system to address this issue, the issue of intimidation and reprisals against individuals who cooperate with the UN on human rights. And I can also say here that you have a special interest in the rights of minorities. And this is really because we witnessed several times your interventions on the protection of indigenous human rights defenders that we really wanted to invite you to our event. And so we are extremely grateful that you accepted and that you will accompany us today. Let me also warmly welcome and thank sincerely the 4 Indigenous women leaders and human rights defenders who agreed to be with us and give us from their time to share their experience and views. And so it's my great pleasure to greet Mrs. Thelma Cabrera. I think she's with us now, I hope. Yes. Thelma is from the Maya Mam people in Guatemala, and she's with CODECA, Comité de Desarrollo Campesino. Mrs. Esther Aluk, who belongs to the Dani tribe, West Papua in Indonesia. She's an Indigenous women activist and a lecturer at Walter Post Theological Seminary. And Mrs. Lucelia Lea Cabral from the Pankara people from Brazil. Is also with CIMI, Consejo Indigenista Missionario. And Mrs. Chandra Tripura from Bangladesh, who is a youth representative to the Executive Council of AIPP, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. And we were hoping and supposed to have as our last speaker, Mr. Marcos Orellana with us, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, but I don't see him yet online, so we hope that he will be able to join us later. So after this brief round of welcoming and introduction, it's my pleasure to finally hand over to Mrs. Reine for her welcoming remarks. Excellency, you have roughly 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dear Assistant Secretary General, Human Rights Defenders, ladies and gentlemen, it is such a pleasure to be with you today. Indigenous peoples in many parts of the world continue to face significant challenges in claiming their rights, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made the situation even harder, as was already pointed out. Indigenous peoples' identity and culture are closely linked to land, and this side event today is a good occasion to raise awareness on rights of Indigenous peoples and on responsibilities of extracting industries. Freedom of expression, association, and assembly, both online and offline, as well as meaningful participation, are key components of democracy and also vital enablers of other human rights. Therefore, it is in our interest that these human rights and the persons defending them are safeguarded and empowered. A strong civil society and a safe environment for human rights defenders should be a priority for all countries. We are concerned that the situation of human rights defenders is becoming more difficult in many countries. Persons belonging to Indigenous peoples, and especially Indigenous women, are all the more vulnerable. They are attacked because they are defending their rights, but they may face also personal discrimination. The forms of discrimination against them are multiple and intersecting. As we all know, the concerns are grave. Indigenous human rights defenders who are trying to protect the environment and traditional way of life may be targeted by arbitrary arrests and detention. Finland is a strong supporter of human rights defenders internationally. There are different ways we are doing this. Internationally, we want that the role of human rights defenders is acknowledged and supported. Finland promotes the protection of human rights defenders, for example, here at the UN, the OACE, and the Council of Europe. Cooperation with the other Nordic countries and like-minded countries is a natural channel for us, as is cooperation within the framework of the European Union. At the country level, our support is framed by the European Union guidelines on human rights defenders from year 2014 and our own national guidelines on how to do this work. Our guidelines encourages Finnish embassies and missions to monitor court proceedings and cases related to human rights defenders across the world with the aim to enhance justice and accountability. We do our best to support civil society, a democratic society which includes an open civil society space will make the work of human rights defenders a lot safer. Furthermore, Finland gives financial support to civil society organizations so that they have resources to reach their goals. We work in coalition with other like-minded countries, and importantly, as a member of the European Union. Not all work we do for human rights defenders is visible.
Check it out. I'll send you another link.
Often quiet work behind the scenes can be effective too. There can even be a division of labor between quiet diplomacy and vocal advocacy by civil society organizations. We can do this work together. As a candidate for the UN Human Rights Council in 2022-24, Finland pledges to support the work and promote the rights of human rights defenders, placing particular attention on both women and Indigenous defenders. With these words, I wish you a great event on this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Permanent Representative, Mrs. Reine, and sorry, we have some hiccups with the techniques, but indeed important words on initiatives that your country and the other member countries of the European Union are taking, and we hope to see you on the Human Rights Council to deploy more of these efforts for sure. We have still some Indigenous representative who may join later, so that's why with the technique I'm afraid we will maybe have a couple of more hiccups, but I'm now really pleased to give the floor to Mrs. Banskaris for opening remarks. So Madam, you have 8 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. It's really a great privilege to be with you and with such great contributors on this panel today. It's really an urgent topic of global concern, so I'm happy to follow also on the words that the Deputy Permanent Representative just said from Finland. We know just on the statistics that across all the regions, human rights defenders are targets of violent attacks. And we have figures that from 2015 to 2019, the UN has recorded at least 1,323 killings and 106 enforced disappearances of human rights defenders across 81 countries. But over 3/4 of killings occurred in Latin America and the Caribbean region. So since 2017, 500 Indigenous people were killed in just 19 countries. According to recent reports of frontline defenders, the over 331 defenders killed in 2020, 28% worked on women's rights, 69% on land, Indigenous peoples and land rights, and 26 people specifically on the Indigenous people's rights. These figures are very stark, and we see exactly what we mean by saying that it's an urgent attack on Indigenous peoples, on individuals, on women, Indigenous rights defenders, but also on civic space overall that is shrinking. The context, of course, is that we know that Indigenous people represent 6% of the global population, but of the world's biodiversity, we have 80% of the world's remaining forest biodiversity lies within Indigenous lands and territories. So great custodians for the entire world of this necessary biodiversity. But we do know also that the attacks in various ways that we have on people, Indigenous peoples who are struggling to exercise the rights to the lands, to territories and resources are particularly widespread, exactly because of projects that relate to extractive industries, to agribusiness, infrastructure projects, and also hydroelectric dams. That's exactly what brings, unfortunately, a high level of risk. We know very well, we keep repeating that we have in the Universal UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the right to free, prior and informed consent. The right is there. but the implementation, of course, is exactly where we have the problem still with all these attacks. There's increasing pressure also, and my mandate as the senior official at the UN dealing with reprisals against persons for cooperation with the UN on human rights. And here we see, unfortunately, also that the pressure is increasing here as well for cooperation in the UN fora by persons of indigenous peoples defenders, and also in other processes. And the incidents really of reprisal and intimidation are very, very clear. And we know that they're underreported because, of course, there is always a risk and fear of further reprisals. The COVID-19 was mentioned already. I will not go into that, but we know that the situation has gotten even worse during this period. Indigenous women defenders are often excluded from access to ownership and inheritance of land, to community negotiations, to decision-making about the future of their land. So there is that particular dimension also for women and girls. And again, the one maybe light that we've had in this recent period when it comes to meaningful participation and consultation, I mentioned that the principle is accepted, but the implementation is a problem. But we have had court cases that have given some encouragement to really fighting for, to see that there really are effective remedies that can work on this. We had a case recently in an indigenous land demarcation landmark decision by the Brazil's Supreme Court, where the judges agreed that in the illegal proceedings that harmed indigenous peoples did not give them the opportunity to participate, that therefore the proceedings had to be annulled. This is of course years of struggles of the Guarani Karowa people defending their lands and rights, and that did lead to this very important decision. We also had another decision in 2017 of the African Court on Human and People's Rights that recognized the rights of the Ogiek peoples in Kenya to land, religion, culture, development, and non-discrimination, and that those had been, the recognition that those had been violated by evicting them from their ancestral lands in the Mau Forest. But this, unfortunately, these are rare cases, which is why we pay so much attention to them. And we obviously still are facing challenges, and to be able to really reach that level of the access to remedy and access to justice. For challenges, I will be try to be brief because there's so much to talk about and I don't want to take the space, but just a few of the key challenges. We know that, of course, indigenous human rights defenders are discriminated against across the board, but indigenous women human rights defenders are doubly targeted, both as defenders of rights, particularly, as we said, in relation to land and natural resources, as we are here for, and also as women and girls defying gender norms. So very often that difficult space of both internal and external layers of discrimination and barriers. The gender-based violence has been widespread, but has also increased, as it has across the globe, I should say, with COVID-19. There are defamation campaigns and various intimidation online. There's also a lack of support, a lack of recognition of the importance of the work, a lack of support politically, but also financially, both by the state, but many other actors as well, that needs to be addressed. And again, coming back to the free, pride, and informed consent, we do have many countries that actually have adopted national legislation to the effect, but we have a very long way to go to making sure that that is implemented in practice. It's beyond simply saying that we have to have meaningful participation for all in democratic society. This is a very specific right that takes very specific measures, and that is something we really need to work on. Again, I will not, in view of time, go into COVID-19 restrictions, but just to flag them exactly as in the introduction, that of course we've had the restrictions of movement, the restriction of access also to justice. In some cases, courts were actually stopped from working for a period of time. And there are many other, and of course also the vulnerability of indigenous peoples to the virus itself, and various effects from the lockdown measures, without going into details on it. What do we need to do? We obviously need to strengthen institutions to make sure that those are inclusive and representative, that there is real and direct access to decision making for indigenous women and girls, for the people who are mostly concerned. We also need to make sure, again, that the free, prior, informed consent is a core of any action, that it really is part of the framework as it is set up, and that it is followed through by mechanisms that make it effective. We have the UN guiding principles on business and human rights already, in addition to, of course, waiting for hopefully a convention at some stage. And in there, we need to really make sure that all of the players in business, all of the actors, make sure that indigenous human rights defenders are protected, that the space, civic space is protected, and the rights primarily also all the way through are protected, including the right to participation, and of course in the decisions that precisely concern the business decisions that are being made. The also states should hold accountable those businesses that are, we all have the division of roles, so it's not just the businesses themselves, but the accountability that the state needs to ensure is there for the actions that are taken, in particularly the extractive industries ones. And then finally, I wanted to make sure that I mention, and then working on, I mentioned those two hopeful cases that we had national court decisions on, but making sure that there is access to justice and that the remedies really are effective. So continuing to work along the lines, the more cases we will get, the more effective will this right become across the board, also in other places. And I wanted to really bring special attention to the regional agreement on access to information, public participation and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Escazú Agreement. As you know, it entered into force very properly last Thursday on Earth Day on the 22nd of April. And that's the first regional environmental treaty containing specific provisions for the promotion and protection of environmental human rights defenders, including indigenous peoples. More than 150 countries recognize the right to a healthy environment, this kind of legal instrument that we have here with the Escazú Agreement is one of the most effective tools to make sure that these rights are recognized and that states therefore can also be held accountable for protecting those rights. So just the final word, the UN, of course, is working very much in line with all of our different actors to make sure that we work for these rights, that we ensure protection mechanisms are in place, that the legal remedies are there. We have been working a lot on the civic space, including recently, we have the Secretary General's call to action for human rights. Under this, we have particularly developed also a civic space guidance that is for the entire UN system, and that's a very important prerequisite, of course, also to be able to do the work as you are doing. We also are part of the Generation, and OHCHR is participating actively in the Generation Equality Action Coalition on feminist movements and leadership, which is, of course, essential to today's discussions as well, and directly is part of it. We have an Indigenous Fellowship Program. It worked differently under COVID, but the good news about that was that we were able to place individual fellows in various country contexts and elsewhere, to be able to see that we really have that continuity of working with the fellows that we've had, and to follow up so that they also end up being able to support others in this very important work. So thank you very much for these introductory chance to give the introductory thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to listening to our great panelists to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Assistant Secretary General, and for these strong words. And you saw today we are only women on the panel, so we try to have a man, but apparently, you know, we are missing him so far. There are special rapporteurs, so, but I'm really very more than happy to be with all of you on this panel. This is very rare that we have only women on such panels. Having said that, my little digression, it was really important that you re-mentioned again the reprisals and mechanisms and other mechanisms at the UN, because some of our panelists, but also more of the indigenous people we work with and other social movement colleagues may really benefit from these mechanisms in very concrete terms. And you mentioned one case among others, the one of the Guarani Kaiowá in Brazil, where there have been some advances with justice or the court. And because we are still waiting for our colleague Thelma from Guatemala, who is trying to connect, having troubles to connect. I will give the floor next to Lucelia from Brazil. So Lucelia Lea Cabral, your people, the Pankara people, have been facing many challenges and threats with the various attacks on the river San Francisco, including through mining and dams. And you will tell us more in that, but let me just highlight that in that regard, the former Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights warned that there are at least 40 dams at risk of collapsing in the country. And as it was said, or it will be said by probably all of you today, rivers are not only a resource for economic activity, but they are considered and as they tend to be considered and treated by dominant models. But so as you said, Mrs. Panscaris, indigenous people are really custodians of a lot of this, I don't say resources, but things we really all depend on. Biodiversity you mentioned, but also the rivers. And so with that, I'm really, really happy to give Lucelia the floor. Lucelia, you have 8 minutes.
Bom dia a todas. Eu me chamo Lucélia, sou indígena do povo Pancará, sou cacique do meu povo Pancará, indígena, Serrote dos Campos, e vivemos na terra indígena Serrote dos Campos, município de Itacuruba, Pernambuco, Brasil. Meu povo indígena vem na luta pela demarcação do nosso território às margens do Rio São Francisco, Grande Opará, há muito tempo. Território esse que, pela morosidade, né, e o descaso do governo brasileiro e a morosidade da FUNAI, ainda não foi demarcado. Notadamente, a Fundação Nacional do Índio, que tem como função garantir direitos e políticas públicas em prol dos povos originários, tem trabalhado em sentido contrário neste governo que está posto. O processo judicial de demarcação da terra indígena Pancará Serrote dos Campos está sendo bastante moroso, sobretudo pelas omissões sistemáticas da Fundação Nacional do Índio, que tem claramente o objetivo de cercear o direito constitucional à demarcação do território indígena. Na luta pela demarcação do nosso território, muitas lideranças do meu povo foram ameaçadas de morte, inclusive a que vos fala. Tendo nós, liderança, que recorrer a programas, né, a inclusão em programas de proteção de direitos humanos, para tentar resguardar as nossas vidas e continuar a luta pelo território. Nosso território tradicional já era ocupado por nossos ancestrais indígenas bem antes da chegada dos colonizadores. O Grande Opará é de grande importância para o bem viver dos povos, tanto com a presença física como para as manifestações religiosas. Tanto é que é fácil de identificar uma grande área de ocupação de vários sítios arqueológicos nas margens desse rio. Porém, por nossos territórios estar próximo ao Rio São Francisco, sempre foi cobiçado pela colonização, com interesse junto às águas, favorecendo a implantação de grandes cidades de produção agrícola, pastoril. Na década de 50, começa a ser implantadas ao longo do Rio São Francisco várias hidrelétricas, desde o estado de Minas Gerais, passando por Bahia, Pernambuco, Sergipe e Alagoas. A barragem de Itaparica, que teve suas comportas fechadas em 1988, alagou a antiga cidade de Itacuruba, assim como outras cidades ao longo do rio, e parte do território do povo Pancará. Na década de 50, diante disso, nossas comunidades foram obrigadas a saírem de seus territórios sagrados. As famílias foram recolocadas em outros municípios, em outras localidades, além do município de Itacuruba, e também alojada em locais chamados por agrovilas, que foram construídas pela CHES, Companhia Hidrelétrica do São Francisco. E nós que decidimos não sair do município, permanecemos. E estamos até hoje na luta pela demarcação de parte dessas terras que não foram alagadas. A cidade de Itacuruba ela é conhecida pelo alto índice de depressão, pelo número altíssimo de suicida. Tudo isso devido à condição de atingidos por essa barragem, que detém essa população, que foi removida dos seus territórios, em um processo de desrespeito, excludente e antidemocrático. E muitas famílias, 30 anos depois da remoção, até hoje não receberam quaisquer indenização para recomeçar suas vidas. Apesar de atingido por essa grande obra, o meu povo indígena foi superando esses anos medonhos e começou a se organizar para poder demarcar um pouco do pedaço que sobrou. Nesse processo de luta, de demarcação pelo território, acabamos sendo surpreendidos com mais um grande projeto de governo, um projeto de instalação de um complexo de usinas nucleares em nossas terras, no nosso Rio São Francisco, confirmada pela Eletronuclear através do Plano Energético 2050. O projeto prevê a construção de 6 reatores nucleares, criando uma sobreposição de interesse ao território, propondo mais uma vez a expulsão da comunidade do seu local de origem. Nosso povo Pancará se vê obrigado a peregrinar em defesa dos seus direitos. O projeto de usinas nucleares em nossos territórios é a morte. É como se a morte estivesse chegando para os nossos povos. E junto a isso, a gente vem articulando com outras comunidades, outros povos que serão atingidos, uma resistência a esse projeto. E conseguimos mobilizar os pescadores, as comunidades quilombolas, os agricultores, o número de moradores das cidades vizinhas, as pastorais. Nós estamos tentando, aos poucos, formar essa grande rede de resistência a esse projeto, para que ele não seja instalado nem no Rio São Francisco, nem nos nossos territórios tradicionais. Também conseguimos articular a população das capitais nordestinas, pois elas estão num raio próximo a ser atingido, direto ou indiretamente, caso a usina nuclear seja construída e caso haja um acidente nuclear. Não queremos usina nuclear em nossos territórios tradicionais. Não queremos usina nuclear no nosso Rio São Francisco, nem no território tradicional de nenhuma população, de nenhum ser vivente desse país. O Rio São Francisco é o maior rio da região Nordeste. É o rio que gera a vida dessa população. Nós queremos projeto de desenvolvimento nacional que ampare os direitos humanos e as comunidades tradicionais e proporcione o bem viver em toda a população e a preservação do meio ambiente. Por isso, nós dizemos não às usinas nucleares em qualquer lugar do mundo, não só nos nossos territórios, não só no Rio São Francisco. Nós estamos na luta pelo reconhecimento do rio, por sua importância de manutenção à vida, sobretudo nas áreas mais secas do Nordeste. Haja vista sua importância histórica de imensa quantidade de sítio arqueológico, como também a história dos nossos ancestrais que estão embaixo dele. O rio, para a gente, é morada dos nossos encantados, e a demarcação do nosso território é a vida. Terra não demarcada significa a morte, significa o descaso, significa o desrespeito, o racismo, o preconceito. A luta é diária, mas nós não iremos desistir. Iremos lutar sempre em defesa dos nossos territórios, pela demarcação da terra, dizendo não às usinas nucleares e a todos os outros projetos de mineração dentro das terras indígenas por esse país.
Thank you so much, Lucelia, for sharing this experience and the situation in your region with us. What I would pick is really the call for a mobilization of all for life and not only of indigenous people. I think this is a really, really important point. So thank you so much. And it was very early for you, but now for the next speaker, it is extremely late because we will go now to West Papua, to Esther Alok, and it is really late for you, Esther. So thank you so much for being with us. But I would like to welcome also Marcos Orellana, or the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, who managed to join us. So welcome, Marcos, and we will see you later. So happy that you could hear a big part of. Yeah, and you have heard a big part of Lucelia's presentation, and now you will hear Esther and the others. So welcome. Esther, you are from West Papua, Indonesia, and we are really interested to hear you now on how your people and indigenous people in general in West Papua experience justice or lack of justice when they are confronted with monoculture and mining projects that destroy nature, culture, and livelihoods. And maybe some things you heard from Lucelia will resonate with your experience in West Papua. Esther, you have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Franciscan International for allowing me to speak and represent my people, West Papua, in this event. Please allow me to convey greetings in my language, containing prayers and hopes from us, the indigenous West Papuan who proudly called our ancestors' land as the land of the morning star. Wah, wah, wah. There are some important issues that I want to address, but because of the time constraints, I would like to highlight some key issues on justice and peace in connection with the operation of the extractive industry, which create conflict, violence, sufferings, and prolonged human rights abuses on our land, West Papua. I have submitted the written form, and I hope it's already distributed to those who attend this webinar. First problem is the land grabbing policy. The implementation of the special autonomy law and the policy to divide West Papua into several provinces leads to the massive clearing of forests for palm oil plantation in some areas. The latest study done by Auriga stated that in the last 2 decades, Papua's forests have shrunk by 6,063.443 hectares. 29% of it happened in between 2001 and 2010, and 70% happened in 2011 until 2019. In the last 3 years, from 2017 to 2021, 1.5 million hectares of land have been taken from the hands of indigenous West Papuan through fraud, intimidation, and various dirty methods. The study also found that from 1992 until 2019, there were 72 forest zone release decree made by the Minister of Forestry, which were used for agriculture and plantation areas all over Papua. The second problem I want to highlight is the establishment of the job creating law, which is known now as Omnibus Law, which is promulgated in 2020. This law has changed 81 existing laws that govern the concession granting process of the natural resources, protection of customary land and resources. This law aimed at facilitating massive land acquisition for investment, the intensification of the extraction of natural resources, and the lifting of sanction and punishment against corporate and environmental crimes. Furthermore, the key articles that regulate environmental protection and the involvement of the local government in conducting environmental risk assessment and supervision are eliminated. Besides, the entire permit for natural resources extraction now determined by the central government, not the government at the local level. Moreover, there is changing in policy related to category of business use right, which previously only applied for 35 years, but now has lengthened into 19 years. This legal reform will push the displacement of indigenous people from their land. The third problem is militarism. West Papua is the most militarized area in Indonesia at the moment. The presence of these security forces have resulted in massive human rights abuses all over Papua. The next problem is the prohibition toward national and international journalists to enter Papua has put us in very vulnerable position because our voice is silenced and the injustice and plunder of our natural resources happen uncontrolled. With the land grab and massive deforestation, women are deprived of access to the forest, which is function as living pharmacy, a source of knowledge production for us. Most of women who live around plantation have deprived from the nature and turned into wage laborers. This situation is happening in a systematic and structured manner and is widespread throughout West Papua. For this reason, we ask for the solidarity and attention of indigenous community around the world to stand with us to fight for our rights to live. On this occasion and through this forum, we would like to call first, the Indonesian government to stop the state policy, especially Omnibus Law or the job creation, in which a wide range of investment incentives are open without proper environmental assessment. This will destroy our nature and sacrifice the indigenous Papuan people whose lives are dependent on the land. Second, to the Indonesian government to take appropriate steps to ensure the implementation of protection of the indigenous people's rights related to lands and territory. Third, to the Indonesian government to withdraw organic and non-organic security forces from all over West Papua. The high presence of the Indonesian security forces who have involved in extractive industry and become actors that destroy Papuan forests, committed intimidation, killings, and other forms of human rights abuses, including silencing democratic freedom and freedom of expression. Fourth, to the United Nations to take appropriate steps in resolving the ongoing conflict that have resulted in humanitarian crisis in Duga and Intan Jaya. Both crises are rooted in the extractive industry that wishes to exploit West Papua's natural resources and the heavy-handed approach by the Indonesian security forces. For that reason, thank you for listening, and thank you for the chance to speak in this forum. Wah, 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 wah.
Thank you so much, Esther. And yes, your presentation, more information will be shared for sure. And thank you for this very clear and strong words. And I think if I pick one thing, it's the isolation from international attention, sometimes that you mentioned. And I think that was important for us as well, that you join us on this event for that reason. So thank you again very much, Esther. And now, thanks to very creative colleagues, I think we will be able to hear Thelma from the Mayamam people in Guatemala. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the technique is challenging us a bit. So, but I think that now we should have be able to hear Thelma over a phone. You can see on the screen of one of my colleagues. Thelma, can you hear us?
¿Puedes hablar, Thelma?
Can you hear us, Thelma? ¿Puedes escuchar? Yes. Okay. So I hope that it will be okay for the interpreters. Let's try. So Thelma, welcome, and sorry that you had so many difficulties to join us. So thanks a lot for the effort. I know it's very early in Guatemala, so we are really grateful for you to join, and we are really happy to have you with us to tell us more on your experience and the experience of your people, of the Mayamam in Guatemala, due to extractive, or in the context of extractive industries or activities. And we know how dangerous your country is for women human rights defenders. Only in 2020, from the 1,034 attacks against human rights defenders, 33 were against women, so as was mentioned. So Thelma, you have 8 minutes. We listen to you. Thank you.
Okay, Thelma, tienes 8 minutos para hablar.
Buenos días acá en Guatemala y a nuestros hermanos y hermanas que están presentes en este espacio. Voy a hablar sobre la realidad de vida de los pueblos indígenas aquí en Guatemala. Las grandes extensiones de monocultivos en Guatemala son cultivadas por manos de obra indígenas. Pero hablemos de las mujeres. Según la investigación laboral que nosotros hicimos como CODECA, las mujeres indígenas que trabajamos en fincas, eso evidencia que el 97% de las mujeres que trabajan en las fincas agrícolas no reciben ni tan siquiera el salario mínimo establecido. O sea, la situación de la realidad de vida de los pueblos indígenas de Guatemala es de explotación y sobreexplotación en el ámbito laboral, pero es más en las mujeres. En las mujeres no se conoce las 8 horas de trabajo, tareas arbitrarias y explotación laboral. Casi no existen las vacaciones ni el aguinaldo, ausencia del salario mínimo, el desconocido bono 14 La mujer trabaja más, pero es menos pagada. Según datos del IC en el 2013, el promedio de salario del afiliado agrícola para los varones es de 1.874 y el promedio para mujeres es de 1.499 en el 2013. El carácter discriminatorio del mercado laboral hacia la mujer en el sector agrícola es un relato de la condición machista y patriarcal del mercado laboral a nivel global. Esto quiere decir de que nosotras las mujeres indígenas vivimos una realidad cruel, que esto nos induce más al empobrecimiento. Cuando nos organizamos a defender nuestros derechos, luego somos criminalizadas, nos tildan de terroristas, de ladrones. No hay condiciones para poder exigir nuestros derechos laborales, porque el principal violador de los derechos laborales de las mujeres y de todo el sector agrícola es el Estado de Guatemala, porque viola los derechos desde la Constitución política, desde los convenios internacionales de la OIT y el Código Laboral. Esto nos obliga a nosotras las mujeres a luchar hacia el proceso de Asamblea Constituyente Popular Plurinacional para el buen vivir. Las mujeres vivimos esa cruel situación. A pesar de ello, hemos salido adelante con nuestros hijos e hijas, que también dentro de este estudio laboral que hicimos, que también evidencia la sobreexplotación también de mano de obra de niños, que en las fincas son utilizadas como ayudantes de madres y padres. O sea, madres y padres van para sacar una jornada, pero nos vemos en esta situación muy preocupante
Thank you so much, Thelma, and really so happy that you managed to join us despite all the difficulties and also very early hour. That's really appreciated, and thank you for the interpreters. I think it was a bit challenging as well, but we really got the message, so very strong message as well. So thanks a lot. Mrs. Burns-Carris, I was hoping to give you a chance to react to some testimonies, but because of the timing, I think if with your permission, I will give you the floor at the end when we go back to everyone. Thank you so much for your understanding. And we have now the last Indigenous women who kindly accepted to join us today, and she's from Bangladesh, Chandra. We are very interested in knowing if what you heard so far resonates with experience in your region, and what challenges you face in Bangladesh as Indigenous youth actively engage in human rights, and especially in the context of, I think, land grabbing and environmental defense. So Chandra, you have 8 minutes.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Kulumka, everyone, and good morning, good evening from Bangladesh. I would like to extend warm greetings to distinguished guests and speakers, Her Excellency Ms. Mayorani, Permanent Mission of Finland, Ms. Ais Burns-Carris, UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Mr. Marcos Oriana, UN Special Rapporteur on Toxic Waste, and all the human rights defenders from Indonesia, Guatemala, Brazil, West Papua, and everyone who are here. I'm really very happy and honored to be a part of this virtual side event on the margins of the 20th United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. You may have known about Bangladesh is home to more than 54 indigenous communities speaking more than 35 languages, who lives both in the mountainous part of the country, which is Chittagong Hill Tracts, and the plainlands of the country as well. The indigenous communities are the main source of the country's diversity, who contributes to the most in nurturing and protecting the natural resources and the forest of the country. But it is said that we indigenous communities are the most marginalized and vulnerable community who have been suffering from different kinds of violations, communal attacks, discriminations, and inequality for centuries. And we, the indigenous youths, particularly young women, are at the forefront of these kinds of violations. And land grabbing is one of the major problems in indigenous people's lives in Bangladesh, and indigenous women who are the main target of different, they are the main target of the different kinds of human rights violations, such as rape, abduction, sexual violence, and the killing after rape particularly in land-related conflicts, especially in marginalized areas such as Chittagong Hill Tracts. So business and corporate organizations, military, and the government itself continues to forcefully grab indigenous people's lands in the name of conservation, development, and tourism. The situation of alienation of indigenous lands and indigenous peoples of the country, both in the Chittagong Hill Tracts and in the plainlands, is highly alarming and continues to deteriorate. Even during this COVID-19 pandemic, Bangladesh military and the Sikdar Group, a private company, which is one of the most powerful private company in the country, has planned to acquire 1,000 acres of land for construction of a 5-star Marriott hotel over the raw indigenous people's land and heritage at Chimbok Hills in Bandarban Hill district of the Chittagong Hill Tracts of the country. So members of that areas who are raw indigenous and other indigenous communities are also afraid that the construction of that hotel will damage Sweden lands, sacred sites, community forests, the natural water resources, and biodiversity in the region. And no doubt that women will be the one to suffer most as they collect water from the natural streams and they collect foods from the forest, including the community forest and the government's reserve forest for their families. After the announcement of the hotel construction last year in 2020, in September, now they are facing the indigenous local raw indigenous communities. They are facing restrictions to enter the forest to collect food, water, and their daily needs. Likewise, it will effectively be destroying their spiritual connection to the forest and the impacts in their traditional culture eventually. The project will make more than 10,000 raw indigenous peoples landless, and the proposed lands are actually mostly Jum land, which is used for their traditional shifting cultivation. Therefore, thousands of raw people will lose their livelihoods. At the same time, women are likely to sexually objectified and become victims of different human rights violations. Well, this is not a new scenario to us. A number of tourism centers have been established forcefully in all 3 hill districts by the military and the corporate organizations without the knowledge and the free, prior, and informed consents of the local communities, the chiefs and headmen, the Hill District Councils, and the Chittagong Hill Tracts Regional Councils. It is seen that that most of the violence against indigenous women, including rape, killings, and any sexual assaults, take place in the tourist areas that was forcefully implemented in Chittagong Hill Tracts. And whoever, particularly indigenous women, young women, human rights defenders who speak against those illegal activities, they face different kinds of threats, including killings. Every year, thousands of acres of indigenous lands are grabbed by different groups across Chittagong Hill Tracts. The illegal encroachment of the land is a clear violation of the Bangladesh Constitution and the Chittagong Hill Tracts Peace Accord 1997, which was signed between the government and the indigenous political party on behalf of the Chittagong Hill Tracts indigenous communities named Parbutu Chattogram Janasambati Samiti. So apart from the land grabbing, indigenous communities in CHT, we also face environmental threats and the health hazards due to the illegal stone extraction and the water pollution from natural water bodies. It is reported that in last year, 2020, a former president of Shetchashabog League, which is a part of the government ruling party, Awami League, in Alikadam Upajala of Bandarban Hill District, named Joinul Abedin. He continues to illegally extract and smuggle thousands of cubic feet of stone every day from the Nayapara Union area of Toin Moja of Alikadam Upajala using the coronavirus situation. So every day they have loaded stones in 1 to 2 trucks and stored lakhs of cubic feet of stones in different places. Locals claimed several times that if the stone extraction is not stopped, the environment in Ali Qadam will be disrupted. And we, all the human rights defenders, especially young human rights defenders, including all our youth organizations in Bangladesh, Indigenous Youth Organization, we have protested, including this incident. But the government seems, not the government's will is not on our side, and it seems that we never receive any justice against Indigenous people's violence situations. Along with this, there are another two businessmen, including the leader of ruling government party. They have been illegally extracting sand from the Sanggu River near the Sanggu Bridge in county of Bandarban Hill district for a long time, in the name of road development and under the name of security forces. And they took the advantage of the coronavirus situation from last year. So all these illegal activities in the name of development are back supported by the military or the government itself, and mostly implemented by the powerful private companies, those affiliated with the ruling political parties. So human rights defenders, particularly young, the young Indigenous women human rights defenders, we continuously face serious threats from both the military, the powerful political leaders, and the government itself while protesting any kinds of human rights violations, including implementation of development projects. And culture of impunity in Bangladesh encourages the perpetrators to commit more violence against the most vulnerable, such as Indigenous women, who never get justice. The abduction case of young women human rights defenders is Kalpana Chakma, who was the then organizing secretary of Hill Women's Federation, a women's rights organization in Chittagong Hill Tracts. I was also a part of these organizations in my student life. She was abducted by the Bangladesh military, and we actually didn't get any justice, yes. And the government and then the military continuously forcing the victim's family to not to fight for the case anymore. And we don't even know that whether she is alive or not, where she is. So we are continuously fighting for us, for the justice of Kalpana Chakma, our young human rights defenders. This is an acute evidence of impunity in Bangladesh. Therefore, it is highly important that global citizens become more aware about Indigenous people's rights, who are contributing equally and actually more than equally than the other peoples in the in all sectors in terms of protecting the mother nature as well. And I highly request all the global citizens to raise strong voice for Indigenous human rights defenders, particularly countries like Bangladesh that is facing serious human rights violations. I would also urge to all the UN agencies to take pluralistic strategies to make sure all state governments, particularly Bangladesh government, take immediate actions to protect their Indigenous rights activists and human rights defenders for respecting and establishing Indigenous people's rights in the country. I would conclude with some recommendations and demands to the Bangladesh government and also to all the UN agencies and our like-minded organizations to make sure that to create some pressures and create some noise so that Bangladesh government ensure constitutional recognition of the identity and the fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples, and ensure gender disaggregated data for Indigenous peoples in regards to different sectors including hosting, food, nutrition, education, healthcare, and in terms of human rights violence of Indigenous women. and also ensure access to justice of all Indigenous women and rights, and bring the perpetrators to justice. Also take effective measures for immediate and full implementation of CHD Accord of 1997 to ensure lasting peace, security, and development of people, including the Indigenous women and girls of the Chittagong Hills of Bangladesh. The last one, but not least, is form an independent land commission for Indigenous peoples of the plains for settling the disputes of the land, and thus to address the violence and harassment of Indigenous women, centering land-related disputes. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you so much, Chandra. With that, I would like to ask participants to send their questions and comments to the through the Q&A function. But in the meantime, I just wanted to know, Mrs. Bronskeris, if you had a question or point of clarification or direct comment to one of our Indigenous speakers before I give the floor to Marcos Orellana.
Well, thank you very much. I would have lots, but I will not do that because I know we're short of time. But I wanted to really express my gratitude, and also the key point of bringing in the impunity question and the linkages that you had in so many of these cases where we have either an actively acting government or at least a complicit government, whether it's at the local or central level, together with other actors, sometimes military, sometimes big business, sometimes transnational business. And there, I think the impunity, rule of law, looking at the corruption aspect as well, because of course, when we are looking at judicial proceedings, which I still think, that there was some glimmers of hope we mentioned, and I think that is a very important thing to have access to justice, to make sure that there is remedy, which, by the way, we know means getting full reparations. It doesn't mean getting a tiny little piece of compensation for land that has been grabbed. It means full reparations. But in order for that system to work, of course, it's a whole rule of law question. So that I'm very glad that you brought that on board, although it's such a big problem. But I also wanted to point out that there's the connection between the domestic systems and the international system, the importance of bringing complaints after they have gone through the exhausted national remedies, to also the possibility of bringing them, including to the treaty bodies. The Human Rights Committee, of course, on ICCPR and CESC in particular, and of course the Human Rights Committee a couple of years ago was specifically bringing in language and the principles of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for instance, the connection, including to self-determination. So not to go into the details there, but I think this is really important that you pointed that out, and the solidarity that is needed, the awareness, and that we come on board, all of us, and the building of the networks to mobilize that support and making sure that we really use all available systems and make sure that they are effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And in fact, it touched upon one of the questions we received in the Q&A function about international networks. But without further ado, because of the time, I will give the floor now to Marcos Orellana, the current Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. Marcos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and apologies for the delay. I want to first of all thank Franciscans International for the invitation to join this conversation. It has been very rich and instructive to hear about the cases in Brazil, Papua, Guatemala, and Bangladesh. As you know, the Toxics and Human Rights mandate has been around for 25 years, and in this time there have been certain key normative developments that are very important for Indigenous peoples, such as the prohibition of storage and disposal of hazardous materials in Indigenous peoples' lands without their free and prior informed consent. But as in other areas of policymaking, we see that this normative development is not accompanied fully with realities on the ground. Challenges continue. Speakers have spoken about land grabbing, about the gender angles. I wish to highlight a couple of points that mandates ongoing work. On the case study on the San Francisco River in Brazil, the nuclear plants that may impact on indigenous peoples there, we have last week seen how Japan helped the discharge contaminated waters from the Fukushima disaster area into the Pacific Ocean. And I wish to highlight this because we can see that nuclear power plants not only impose catastrophic impacts if something goes wrong with exposure of people to health and thyroid cancers in children, massive displacement and internally displaced people, but also their operation, the normal operation of power plants contaminates waters. And the Fukushima situation has put on the spot how the treatment processes for those contaminated waters create uncertainties. Japan has argued that the treatment processes renders the water safe. And yet there are scientists that point out that the treatment process does not clean the radioactive substance of tritium. And they're pointing out that the standards of protection are inadequate because tritium has not been sufficiently studied in their organic compositions. What I mean by that is that the radioactive substance combines with organic substances and then moves up the food chain, eventually contaminating. You question the operation of nuclear power plants all around the world. It is not just a question of the discharge of the contaminated waters in Fukushima. This is where an affirmation of the right to science in international human rights law and the importance of the precautionary principle can really provide protection for the people that may be impacted by the operation of these nuclear power plants. So that first point I thought I'd remark. I'd also want to highlight is looking at in terms of the shortcomings of international responses in dealing with the extractive industries and indigenous peoples. And I'm thinking here specifically about artisanal small-scale gold mining and mercury. Mercury trade is rampant. We have the Minamata Convention on Mercury in force, in operation. It is going into its 4th conference of the parties. But when it comes to artisanal and small-scale gold mining, we see that still 14,000 tons of mercury are released into the environment every year. The point about biomagnification, so mercury going up the food chain and impacting on indigenous peoples that be far removed from the Arctic is an example. But of course, the direct impact of artisanal and small-scale mercury mining in tropical places like the jungles in Indonesia or the Amazon in Brazil or Bolivia or Peru is having direct impacts on indigenous peoples. And the last example I thought I'd mention is the one, of course, on extractive industries and the life cycle of plastics, where we see that exploration and exploitation of fossil fuels for plastics elaboration production is a serious problem all around the world. But it's not just exploration, exploitation, which have been well studied. It's also legacy. What happens after the operation ceases? Often contamination that affects indigenous people's lands and, of course, their rights. And it's also a question of transport.
Oh, I think the connection is not great, at least for me. Marcos, maybe you want to switch off your camera and maybe.
Sorry about the poor connection here.
Can you hear us? Okay, so I think, Marcos, I will give you the floor again. I think that Mrs. Brans-Carris needs to leave a bit earlier, if I understand correctly. So maybe it's the opportunity for me just to let you go. I was happy to have given you the floor again in between. Sorry, Marcos, I will go back to you. But really, thank you again so much for having been with us all the time, and for sure, I think you will hear from us and from all the colleagues who were with us today. Thank you again a lot for your time, Mrs. Brans-Carris. Marcos, you want to give it a try, your third point?
Thank you, Sandra, and apologies for the poor connection. I think I got lost in or the connection is people's. I was pointing out about the life cycle of plastics and pointing out that it wasn't only exploration and exploitation for fossil fuels, but also legacy issues. What happens when companies just pack up and leave, and they leave a legacy of contaminated sites that impacts on the waters and the food sources of indigenous peoples, and issues of transport. I was pointing out on oil spills affecting indigenous coastal communities, spills from pipelines. They are well documented as well. So given the time, I'd like to round up by pointing out the importance of the reaffirmation of a rights-based approach. This is a vision of commitment to human rights. This is a focus on rights and rights holders, and it's also a priority on those people that are in vulnerable situation. And this is also where indigenous peoples come in, given what we've heard from panelists.
Well, I think we lost you, at least your sound is not working. But we heard very clearly your point.
The marginalization of voices, the marginalization. Okay.
Yeah, it's very difficult to follow because you're cutting off. So sorry for that, but because of the time, I think we heard very much your point on the 3 points and on the human rights based approach and why we should pursue it. So with your permission and with that, I will go back very quickly to our four panelists and with us a couple of specific questions if you want to tackle it in 2 minutes each. I think there was one on the non-recognition of indigenous people as indigenous people, especially for West Papua. I think, Esther, this one is for you. How you think UN or international attention can also help in that. And then about networks of indigenous people, how they have been built at national, regional, and international level. Maybe Chandra, you want to say something for AIPP as an example, but we have others, and I encourage every one of you to go to the websites of ESCR.net to find more about different networks, including of indigenous people. And then if I'm, I think that's how can indigenous people get protected without undermining national sovereignty and development. So I think that's a question or a point that I would like to give back to Lucelia and Thelma in a couple of minutes, because I'm sure you hear this several times in your life and in your activism. So maybe Esther, you want to go first? We can't hear you, Esther.
Is it the questions about in Indonesia, the government doesn't recognize the status of indigenous people?
Yes, if you can just say a couple of words, because unfortunately time is really short, but I wanted to give it back to you.
Yeah, I think we have tried as indigenous people, we have tried like several channels to speak up about this matter. It's been like for years we have been tried, but like more policy have been implemented in West Papua that really our voice is not heard. So by channeling, by like this opportunity, like this event, it's really helping us to voice what is really going on in West Papua, because the international support is really important in bringing the government to implement the law, because the freedom of expression, we don't have the freedom of expression at the moment. And as I have mentioned before, the press, the international journalists is not prohibited to enter West Papua. So we are now facing more challenges to be heard. That is why we address this through this kind of events to be heard. So that's the chance that we have for the international network. We'll build international network to pay more attention to this, because our land is being taken, and it means it's destroying our life. Our life is depend really on the land. So I think through this occasion, I'm asking and humbly ask for support and solidarity from other indigenous people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for that. Maybe Chandra, you go next. Again, quickly, I'm so sorry, we are running out of time already.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra, and thank you also to Henry for the question. Well, we have been building support both in national and international level, following some strategies. In the national level, what we do, we approach to all the human rights defenders who are not indigenous, and their organizations, including Human Rights Commission in the National Human Rights Commission in Bangladesh. We have a very good relation with Bangladesh National Human Rights Commission. So this is how we, in the national level, we actually approach to them, and we support each other for, we also raise indigenous communities and indigenous human rights defenders, including organizations, indigenous people's organizations. We also raise voice on different causes, which is also not related to indigenous peoples. At the same time, we expect that they also raise voice for us. This is how we build support, create network in national level. And in the international level, we reach to each other, and through creating building different kind of networks within the indigenous communities, and the EIPP itself is a that kind of platform for all indigenous peoples to raise indigenous voice for indigenous peoples. And the EIPP, including other indigenous peoples organization in the regional level and the international level, are constantly having dialogue with UN agencies, donor organizations who are working for indigenous people. This is how we in the international level, we are actually building support. And I believe that UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is also a great achievement of this kind of networks in the international level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chandra. And usually you would meet all together in person, or many of you, but I'm happy that at least we can meet virtually. I will give the floor now to Thelma, if you want to answer about, how to balance development and the rights of indigenous people in some minutes, if you want. I don't think that the mic is on.
Selma. Selma. Para ti.
I don't think we can hear,
Selma,
unfortunately.
Quiero ver, ¿no me escuchan?
Sí, ahora sí. Mal, pero sí.
¿Cuál es la pregunta?
No, we can't hear. We can't hear. I'm so sorry.
¿Cómo ves tú los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, culturales y el desarrollo?
Bueno, los derechos de los pueblos indígenas son muy violentados aquí en Guatemala. La palabra desarrollo es desarrollo, pasa llevando la vida de nosotros como pueblos indígenas porque su objetivo es el dinero. Todas las empresas transnacionales extractivas que operan en Guatemala asesinan, encarcelan y violan todos los derechos de los pueblos. Hay presos políticos por defender lo que es la vida. Defendemos los ríos, nuestro territorio, nuestra madre tierra. Se hace consulta popular, pero eso no se respeta. Entonces, el derecho de los pueblos indígenas en sí, nosotros y nosotras estamos luchando para que eso se respete, pero el Estado de Guatemala, en complicidad de las empresas transnacionales, asesina, encarcela a defensores y defensoras de los derechos de los pueblos y mucho más de los pueblos indígenas. Todos los casos de asesinato han quedado en la impunidad. La persecución que hace el Estado de Guatemala hacia la lucha en la resistencia en las comunidades se ve palpablemente, porque dentro de ellas hemos hecho denuncias a nivel internacional, nos hemos organizado para ser comunicadoras interculturales y eso lo visibilizamos a través de las redes sociales como medios alternativos para denunciar todas esas violaciones. Entonces, como pueblos indígenas, debemos luchar para que se respeten nuestros derechos, pero también ser sujetas políticas también, porque eso de que juegan con nuestras vidas, nos miran inhumanos, eso va a depender de nosotras. Y nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, también de construir ese poder dentro del pueblo para que esta situación cambie. No podemos seguir pidiendo favor, porque en nuestras manos está todo lo que son nuestros derechos y por ende luchamos nosotros y nosotras como pueblos, como mujeres, para que se respeten nuestras vidas, porque estamos cansados de tanta violación hacia nuestros derechos como pueblo. Gracias.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, no, I was thanking Thelma a lot for this, and that we can all agree that development that leads to crimes against human rights defenders, is not good for anyone. And with that, I will give the last word to Lucelia. If you want to give your last comments, maybe including on this issue of development and indigenous people's rights. Lucelia, you have 2 minutes.
A luta pelos direitos humanos em todo o mundo é muito difícil. Defender os nossos territórios, defender a nossa história de sofrimento, de resistência, cada vez mais se torna mais difícil. Por essa razão, quero agradecer pela oportunidade de hoje estar participando deste momento tão especial com grandes mulheres, lideranças nos seus povos. E também para convocar, para que se una a nós contra esse grande projeto, contra esse projeto da morte que está sendo pensado para destruir ainda mais os nossos povos e os nossos territórios. Não é fácil uma comunidade lutar sozinha. Não é fácil um povo indígena lutar sozinho. Mas se ele se soma a outros povos que lutam pela vida, que lutam por direitos humanos, a gente será vencedor. Então, meu desejo hoje é esse, que todos vocês que estão me ouvindo se somem a gente nesse momento contra esse grande projeto no nosso território e em defesa da vida.
Thank you so much, Lucelia. And honestly, this is a perfect conclusion of our event. So I have nothing to add to that. That was really words of wisdom. I just let you all go with a big thanks to all our panelists, also those of the panelists who had to leave a bit earlier, and also really a big thanks to our interpreters for an amazing job in difficult technical conditions. So really thank you a lot, and yeah, and have a good rest of your day for those of you. And Esther, please go to bed now because that's so late. So thank you so much, everyone, really, and hope to see you soon again together.